This time on the yarn, we've got the Chief Executive of CoreLogic, Tim Lawless. Welcome, Tim.
G'day, Andrew. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Great to have you. And as many of our listeners would know, CoreLogic has been an organisation that is very prominent in collecting information and data about housing. And so when you read the papers or you listen to the news, you'll often hear CoreLogic data says this, CoreLogic data says that. And so that's why we thought, given how important data is in our lives, it'd be very valuable to hear from Tim today. And so I guess I'm kind of going to kick off with, how do you see the state of the housing system today in Australia?
The housing system, well, yeah, a little bit different from the housing market, I suppose. The system itself is, I suppose, in some ways a little bit broken. We're moving through this extended period where we're just not seeing any real matching between underlying demand in the housing market and supply, which really helps to explain why we've seen such significant growth in housing values at a time when you'd normally expect the market to be quite flat in terms of value growth. You know, we're in an environment where interest rates are quite high. There's been a cost of living crisis, if you will. We're seeing, up until recently, consumer sentiment's been very low, yet we've still been seeing housing values rising quite rapidly in some markets. But fair to say that's starting to cool down now in most areas around the country. But I think as we start to see some rebalancing between that underlying supply and demand balance over the coming years, hopefully, that's where we'll probably see the market taking a bit of a breather and hopefully allowing affordability to catch up.
Yeah, one of the interesting data points that we had the Parliamentary Library pull together was how many completions have there been since the Second World War. And back in 2018, we hit the high watermark of about 220,000. Now this year we're down to 160,000. So, what's your take on that? Do you think that's a really telling point?
It is, absolutely. And it's a good piece of context to remember that high point in 2018 was very much influenced by a surge in high-rise construction activity across particularly Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne. And a lot of those markets where we did see this influx of new supply, particularly high-rise supply, think about areas like the Melbourne CBD or South Bank Docklands, or in Sydney it was around Parramatta, Olympic Park, Brisbane around the CBD itself. A lot of these markets have actually seen housing values holding really firm, if not even lower than what they were when that supply was first introduced to the market. It's a pretty good testament to how more supply can actually tame price growth and really improve the level of affordability. But there's probably also another element there that influx of high-rise supply through, it's pretty much 2014 to 2018, was also in many ways the sort of housing stock that not a lot of people really aspire to live in. And I think that's another reason why we're seeing a lot of those precincts still lower in value now than what they were when they were first built.
So at 160,000 houses this year, we're down to the levels that we saw in the year 1989. So it's a pretty scary picture, isn't it? And we don't appear to be heading in the right direction. We appear to be heading in a direction where we're going to sort of stagnate at around this level for the next year or two.
Yeah, and especially when you overlay it with population growth, which, as everybody would appreciate, has been significant through the past couple of years since international borders reopened. There's been a bit of a catch-up in population growth that simply hasn't been accompanied by a rise in supply for a whole bunch of reasons. No doubt you've covered a lot of those reasons on the previous episodes of your podcast. But it looks pretty clear, I think, Andrew, that we're not going to meet the supply targets that we have over the near term, let alone over the next 5 years, with the government's fairly aggressive 1.2 million well-located homes target. Most people would agree we're not going to get there. Although it's a good goal to have, don't get me wrong, it's great to have a stretch target, but until we start fixing some of the underlying factors that are keeping supply out of the market, like very low profit margins, high building costs, really tight labour environments, a lot of competition with big infrastructure projects as well. All these things, I think, are going to keep a lid on housing supply for at least the next 18 to 24 months.
So What then do you think the Commonwealth government can do to help on the supply front? Because this government has had a range of policies, including setting up of new agencies and organisations. It has had the housing targets, as you just referred to. Um, what is it that the Commonwealth government could do to drive supply, do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that the federal government could be doing, both in a fairly short term and a longer term perspective. I think there's a real immediacy to this situation we're in at the moment. So, looking at some of the most immediate ways that the federal government could support a housing supply response, I think probably comes back to just supporting the industry to deliver stock to the marketplace. I recall, the coalition's announcement of the $5 billion infrastructure fund. I mean, that's a great example of a really immediate leg up for supply. It has nothing to do with demand. It's not a demand side response of giving more, say, first home buyers a concession or some financial support to get into the marketplace. This is pure supply side, which is what we need to see more of. And it has a real immediacy to it as well. For shovel-ready projects, one of the biggest obstacles for getting supply into the market is simply, covering a lot of those big infrastructure costs, be it, connecting the water, sewage, electricity, all that sort of stuff, the lighting. Those headworks charges, if you will, might take up, say, somewhere between 8 to 12% of a project's build cost. So providing that, and they're fairly early in the piece as well, so providing that as some support to the industry, I think would overcome the challenges around profitability and feasibility, and also help to fast track some projects that are ready to go but simply aren't going at the moment, either due to a lack of feasibility or a lack of finance.
Some developers I talk to say that they are on the hook for building roads and putting in streetlights. I mean, is that a common occurrence?
Yeah, that's been the case for a long time. I think you'd have to go back probably a good 20 or 30 years to see this gradual metamorphosis away from the government funding some of those infrastructure costs towards the private sector funding them. So, it's probably somebody else's role to talk about whether that's the right way or the wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
But fair enough. I think at the moment, given just this squeeze on profitability we've seen, and obviously a private sector development in it to make a buck, they're not there to deliver social housing or profitless builds. I think covering those infrastructure costs, at least for a short period of time, acknowledging that we're in this supply crisis, would be a good outcome.
Yeah, because there's no way that the government itself, no matter how big its housing future fund might be or whatever it wants to call it, can build the houses. I mean, the private economy, private builders and the private developers are ultimately need to have a viable product to solve the problem, don't they?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other alternative, of course, which is still a big part of delivering supply, is also social and community housing as well, which does come from funding from the government, at least partial funding from the government as well. And that's another way to get more, I suppose, affordable or socially accessible housing into the marketplace.
Mm. So your view is that we need to find a better way for the market to deliver housing, cutting the costs through various government interventions on the supply side, you think is wise. And then what about the issues to do with the National Construction Code? I mean, a lot of people say that this code has needlessly increased costs, but then other people would say, well, there needs to be more efficient houses built or houses which are better suited to our environment. So, I mean, what do you make of that debate?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the National Construction Code minimum standards for energy efficiency and sustainability.
Yep.
You might have noticed we did put a report out on this just recently, looking at just median energy efficiency star ratings for fairly modern homes built from 2010
Yep.
and those built pre-2010. And there's a massive difference in the energy efficiency ratings, which I would put down to the fact that minimum standards were introduced back in 2010 for minimum 6-star ratings, and then more recently it's a 7-star rating. I think a 10-year freeze on the construction code, I think is a step backwards from trying to meet our Paris Agreement targets and net zero emissions targets, and even just delivering stock to the marketplace that has minimum energy efficiency standards, I think is something we should be aspiring to, partly because it lowers carbon, but also it's just cheaper running costs as well. It's more comfortable, more livable homes. And maybe even beyond that, beyond newly built homes, which are about 20% of our housing stock built after 2010, you've also got the opportunity to retrofit existing homes, and I think that's probably another bit of low-hanging fruit there, is to incentivize homeowners to insulate, double glazing, that type of thing, looking at ways to minimize their energy emissions for the vast majority of stock that isn't newly built.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was chairing an inquiry into household electrification, and sure, you can make great gains in terms of equipping the house with solar panels and with a battery, but also you can just improve the efficiency of a house and get a very similar outcome if you have better insulation, you cover up drafts under doors, those sorts of things. I mean, it's quite remarkable actually how efficiency can really assist.
Yeah, those two things, insulation and glazing, are absolutely game changers, and they make a massive difference as well. I think there's still there's definitely room for low energy light fittings and solar panels and batteries and that type of thing. But it's I think the basics of insulation and double glazing, particularly in extreme climates, really does make a lot of sense.
Okay, now tell me about your business at Core Data. What are the most asked for data points?
So at CoreLogic, absolutely, it's measuring values, and this tends to be where we get most of the interest in what's happening
House
with
values, yeah.
with housing values. Absolutely. So, the trends are really diverse. I mean, at a really broad macro view, you've got a national housing market where values have risen by about 5.5% over the past 12 months. Well, that sounds pretty strong. It's clearly slowing. We go through, say, the middle of the pandemic, we're seeing housing prices nationally rising at about 24% per annum. It's quite extraordinary at a time when, it was when international borders were closed, but of course, interest rates were next to nothing. So we're in a market now that's clearly slowing down in its rate of value growth. Sydney's moved into a couple of months of decline now. Melbourne's been declining in value for the past 12 months. Whereas the mid-sized capitals like Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, very strong, but also slowing down as well. So to answer your question, absolutely, most of the questions we get will be around housing values, but then peripherally things like, well, what's turnover like across the country? So the volume of home sales, how many listings are in the marketplace to purchase, which is starting to rise now as well. What are rental markets doing? Which, interestingly enough, that the rental boom is well and truly over. Andrew, the last 6 months, our national rental index has been just flat. Vacancy rates are rising as well. And then, I suppose from a more corporate perspective, we work with a lot of banks, government departments, insurers, and so forth, and they tend to be much more focused on risk. Risk and opportunity, I suppose, probably in that order as well. Given that our banking and finance sector has a significant exposure to residential mortgages, more than 60% of the book for banks, then absolutely, they're very interested in understanding risk in housing markets.
Yeah. So a lot of people say to me, if you look at Australian housing, there's a Australian housing problem, then there's a Sydney housing problem.
Yeah, well, Sydney does stand out. If you look at any of the affordability metrics, Sydney's top of the pops, right? You've got a dwelling value to income ratio in Sydney that's nearly 10 times. That simply means if you're on a median income, household income in Sydney, you're paying about 10 times your gross annual income to buy the medium price dwelling. If you look at another metric on affordability, a serviceability metric, if you're again on the median income in Sydney and you're buying the median home on a variable interest rate and you've got a 20% deposit, it means you'd be dedicating 62% of your gross income to servicing your mortgage. Now, clearly, no lender is going to lend on those sort of margins. So what it really means is that if you're on the median income in Sydney, you probably can't afford to buy the median dwelling value anymore. Far from it, in fact. You're very much, your demand is being deflected well and truly towards the lower quartile of the market. And interestingly, that's where we're seeing some resilience in value falls is generally around those mortgage belts, probably no longer the domain of, say, first home buyers or lower income families. They do tend to be much more popular now with the middle of the marketplace, simply because that's where they can get credit and afford to or demonstrate the serviceability.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the new measures that passed Parliament recently was the program called Help to Buy, and that has a cap of $900,000 in Sydney or in New South Wales. So, as far as I can see, most houses in Sydney wouldn't be available for that scheme, would they?
No, not at all. You've got a median house value in Sydney that's getting sort of close to the 1.2 million mark. If you look at, say, the quartile values across Sydney, if you're buying, say, a house in Sydney rather than an apartment,
Yeah.
the lower quartile of the market is just above $1 million now. So this is the lower quartile is simply your 25th percentile. So it's the cutoff for what the lower 25% of the marketplace is typically worth. So you've got a lower quartile house value of just over $1 million, a lower quartile unit value of about $670,000 as well. So yeah, I think for a lot of families or households that are in that lower income quartile, it's going to be really hard to even buy a unit in the lower quartile of the marketplace. So it's a real, I suppose, it's just a sad indictment of the affordability challenges we have around Australia. And to your point, Sydney does stand out more than other markets, but surprisingly, somewhere like Adelaide has really risen up through the ranks of unaffordability. It's the second most unaffordable market now when you adjust for local incomes after Sydney.
So when I ask you about first home ownership prospects, those are the metrics you use, aren't they? It's the income to house price ratio and the serviceability.
Yeah, there's a few others as well. So they're probably the two go-to affordability measures. There's also things like how long does it take to save for a 20% deposit, which in Sydney, if you can save 15% of your gross income, it'll take you about 13 years to save a 20% deposit. So yeah, there's a bunch of metrics, and you can also look at like a rental affordability metrics as well, which are pretty blown out. So yeah.
Sorry, you said 13 years to save a 20% deposit in Sydney.
Yeah, that's right. That's for immediate income, not a lower quartile income either. So, and that's if you can save 15% of your income a year, which at the moment is pretty hard to do given the cost of living and how high rents are. So, yeah, if you go back, say, 10 years or so, it was still taking about 9.8 years in Sydney. Yeah. So it was still high, but it's a lot higher now, and that is a record high.
Yeah, so for the average person who finishes a trade or does a university degree in their sort of early to mid-20s, so let's say that they're 24, so they'll be 37 by the time they get the 20% deposit.
Yeah, I mean, there is an option to buy a home without a 20% deposit, so a 10% or, as you know, deposit
with LMI.
available. Yeah, exactly. You can get LMI or some of the government schemes that are available with small deposits as well. So there's that. But yeah, the traditional 20% deposit where you avoid LMI and you have a fairly low LVR of 80%, then yeah, 13 years is the norm.
Yeah, it's a long time, which is why we've opened up a debate about allowing people to use their own super, because we recognise how difficult it is for some people. But the LMI piece is also interesting. I mean, we did an inquiry looking at how APRA allocates the risk capital weights for LMI. And I think it's very clear that APRA preferences, this is the prudential regulator, they preference parental guarantees over LMI, which I think is actually quite regrettable given that we shouldn't be basing the system around who's got access to the bank of mum and dad, should we?
Yeah, that's not very equitable at all. I agree. And for those that have the benefit of some wealth in the family, no doubt, it's really hard to measure. I think you'd agree, Andrew, that we don't really know how much intergenerational wealth transfer is at play at the moment. But it probably does help to explain how a market like Sydney is held up reasonably strong despite some of these affordability metrics being massively blown out.
Yeah. So what else could we do for first home buyers, do you think?
Well, yeah, we touched on this a bit earlier on. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of first home buyer leg ups because it just tends to stimulate demand. I'm much more of a fan of supply side policies and getting more supply into the marketplace, which hopefully just keeps a lid on prices and provides some level of access over the medium to long term, but fully acknowledge that first home buyers are really sensitive to stimulus. So just go back to, say, the GFC, for example, where when the first home buyers grant had the boost. So I think you get $14,000 for an established home and $21,000 for a newly built home. I mean, first home buyer demand rocketed at that stage. It went up to about 43% of owner-occupier demand for lending, which was huge. And then you can see over time, there's other examples where, the home builder grant was another really good example, even though that wasn't exclusive to first home buyers. As a first home buyer, you could take that. You could take your first home buyer's grant. You could take the really low interest rates. And again, we saw first home buyer activity rocket.
Yeah.
So, I think, with that in mind, if you really did want to get more first home buyers into the marketplace, those sort of demand side stimulus policies are demonstrably working, and they do work. But they tend to be short-lived. And like I said, I find they tend to push up prices and don't really deliver any real long-term benefit to the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone understands that supply is the main game, but if there are sensible ways you can bend the scale for first home buyers, I think it's crazy not to look at it given the situation we're in with so many millennials and Gen Zs on the wrong trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the productivity review on retirement income. I know it's a long way off from first home buyers, but it just demonstrates the earlier you get into home ownership, generally the better off your outcomes are going to be when you move into your mature ages as well, rather than renting in retirement, which tends to have a higher correlation with levels of poverty. So yeah, I fully agree. The earlier you can get into housing, generally the better. But ideally, it's accompanied by a supply side response as well.
Of course, and that's why the key determinant of your success in retirement is your housing status, not your superannuation balance. So, but Tim Lawless, fantastic to have you on the yarn today. Thank you very much for what you do at CoreLogic, and it's always great to read your data almost in every medium. So thank you very much.
Benji, absolute pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.